Last time we spoke, Lin Zexu's efforts against opium were not going well enough, and he was losing favor with Emperor Daoguang. It seems his aggressive actions had brought war upon the Qing Dynasty. The British warships proved too formidable, their cannons superior, and the Qing were losing territory such as Jusan Island. Even the mighty Dagu forts were no match for the British warships, who sailed through Chinese waters uncontested. Tixan began talks with the British, telling them Lin Zexu might be fired at any moment, and that he would most likely be his replacement. Elliot faced a hostage crisis yet again, with the captives from the Kite being held in Ningbo. He had to negotiate a ceasefire in the meantime. But now, Britain's most powerful weapon had just arrived to China, the Nemesis. This episode is part 2 of the First Opium War, the Nemesis Terror. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just wanted to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast, the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, narrated and written by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. If you prefer more of a visual experience, I have a 45-minute episode on the First Opium War, as well as the Second Opium War, and I did a historic film review of the film, The Opium War. A lot of Opium War stuff. Check it out, it means a lot to me. The emergence of steam power in the 19th century is somewhat comparable to the emergence of nuclear power in the 20th. Its power would make its worldwide debut during the First Opium War. The 660-ton steam warship, Nemesis, was launched in 1839 and arrived in China at the height of the Ningbo prisoner crisis. Nemesis had an iron hull, giving it outstanding armor for its time. The coal consumption for the Nemesis was an absolute nightmare, and this made its journey from Britain to China quite a slow process, as it had to make numerous coal stops. Nemesis arrived to Macau on November the 25th of 1840, and it soon crossed the Gulf of Canton and set anchor in Dangu, awaiting for the arrival of the man-of-war Melville. Nemesis arrived at a perfect time to intimidate the Qing, as Tixan and the two Elliots were negotiating. The three men would meet aboard the Melville, outside Canton's harbor, on November the 29th, and Tixan offered some promising news. Governor-General Lin Zexu had finally been fired by Emperor Daoguang, as a result of not fully eradicating the opium trade. The emperor had said this to Lin Zexu: "Externally, you wanted to stop the trade, but it has not been stopped. Internally, you wanted to wipe out the outlaws, but they are not cleared away. This has caused the waves of confusion to arise, and 1,000 interminable disorders. In fact, you have been as if your arms were tied, without knowing what to do. It appears that you are no better than a wooden image." Ouch. Lin Zexu tried to make his case to the emperor, stating the barbarians were being ruined by dysentery and malaria, and he predicted they would be unable to maintain their troops so far away from their home and soon would have to depart. Lin Zexu begged Emperor Daoguang not to give in to the barbarians. They would best deploy the military rather than diplomacy. The more they get, the more they demand, and if we do not overcome them by force of arms, there will be no end to our troubles. Moreover, there is every probability that if the English are not dealt with, other foreigners will soon begin to copy and even outdo them. Emperor Daoguang angrily replied this: "If anyone is copying, it is you. who are trying to frighten me just as the English tried to frighten you." And so, Lin Zexu left Canton in disgrace. But while en route to Beijing, he was given orders to return to Canton to assist Zishan in negotiations with the barbarians. The two Eliots, when hearing about Lin Zexu's dismissal, were quite relieved. They assumed this meant the emperor was planning to make peace. Charles Eliot at this time would also lose the help of his cousin, George Eliot, as George had developed heart problems and had to sail back to England. For the negotiations at Canton, Eliot wanted to bring some more intimidation, so he gathered some warships and more troops at Canton. Zishan began negotiations on December the 4th by apologizing for the cannon attack on the British by the Bogue forts, and as I said previously, handed over poor old Stanton. Eliot began negotiations by demanding 4 ports be opened for trade: Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and Amoy. He also demanded the surrender of an unspecified island, reimbursement for the confiscated opium chests, and of course, reparations for the war itself. Quite a large pill to swallow. Eliot was hoping such demands would be met quickly, because the British began to fear both France and Russia would begin joining the little war, and plying for their own share in its spoils. Zishan agreed to pay $5 million over the course of 12 years. Eliot, however, wanted $7 million in 6 years, and the surrender of at least Amoy and Chushan. The men eventually agreed to $6 million, but Zishan refused any territorial demands. Eliot resorted to threats. "There are large forces collected here, and delays must breed amongst them a very great impatience." Soon Eliot began ordering his troops to go ashore and perform military drills and target practice. At the beginning of 1841, negotiations were still stagnant. Then a rumor spread that the emperor had chosen war, and Eliot decided to prepare. On January the 5th of 1841, Eliot informed Zishan that if an agreement was not reached within 2 days, he would recommence war at 8 a.m. on July the 7th. Well, no agreement came, and Eliot made good on his threat. On the morning of July the 7th, a force of 1,500 soldiers, marines, and sailors aboard Madagascar, Enterprise, and the Nemesis landed at the mouth of the Canton River. Their escort force of 4 sailing and 4 steam warships began to bombard the Chambi forts and the walls of the Tsokakhtao fort across from Chambi. When the 8,000 Chinese defenders in the forts saw the British ships, they initially screamed at them and waved flags in defiance, while they opened fire from their batteries. However, the Chinese cannons were all tied down and could not properly aim at the invaders, and thus after 20 minutes of firing at the barbarians, they soon stopped. When they stopped firing, the British took advantage of the ceasefire and 2 companies of Marines scaled over the Chambi earthen walls at 9:30 a.m. The muddy flats in front of the fort made dragging the artillery pieces a nightmare, as the men looked up at the forts to see Qing soldiers screaming and waving flags at them. Yet the British bombardment was targeting the Chinese cannons, and they soon were getting knocked out one by one. Many of the Qing soldiers were told the British killed all their prisoners, and thus many resisted to the bitter end. One British officer said of the carnage, "It was a frightful scene of slaughter that ensued, despite the efforts of the British officers to restrain their men." By 11 a.m., the Qing banner was lowered by the British, whom raised the Union Jack in its place. The British reported that they had killed over 600 Qing soldiers and took another 100 prisoner. The British reported 30 casualties of their own, but as they put it, not because of any Chinese defender, no, only because of an accidental explosion from their own overheated artillery pieces. Many Qing defenders fled the city, but Major Pratt of the 26th Regiment flanked their retreat, forcing many back into the forts. The British warships continued to shell the city, killing numerous defenders. Once it looked like Chambi was simmering down, the British ships began to fire upon 11 Chinese war junks anchored at the mouth of the river using Congreve rockets. One British officer who witnessed the event stated this: "The very first rocket fired from the Nemesis was seen to enter the large junk. and almost the instant afterwards it blew up with a terrific explosion, launching into eternity every soul aboard, and pouring forth its blaze like a mighty rush of fire from a volcano. The instantaneous destruction of the huge body seemed appalling to both sides engaged. The smoke, and flame, and thunder of the explosion, with the broken fragments falling all around, and even portions of dissevered bodies scattered as they fell, were enough to strike with awe, if not fear, the stoutest heart that looked upon it. Both the Chinese artillery on top of the forts, as well as the Chinese war junks, did not return fire. Instead, the defenders were fleeing or jumping overboard to get away from the naval bombardment. The British fired muskets at them, as they did so, killing many. Inside one of the forts, many Qing defenders were becoming burned and horribly disfigured because of the antiquated matchlocks gunpowder would often explode on them. The British gunfire also added to their misery. A staff officer who took part in the battle wrote later in life, "The slaughter of fugitives is unpleasant, but we are such a handful in the face of so wide a country and so large a force that we should be swept away if we did not deal our enemy a sharp lesson whenever we came in contact." As the British warships bombarded the Chinese war junks, the Chinese captains fell into a rout, scattering into Anson's Bay, just east of Chanbi. One extremely lucky Congreve rocket fired from Nemesis hit one of the war junk's powder magazines, exploding it to pieces. The 14 other war junks witnessing this continued to scatter, and many of their crew jumped overboard to escape. Nemesis did not pursue them any longer, and instead steamed upriver, torching a few more war junks as it went along, and seized others before rejoining the armada. 3 more forts remained operational near Chanbi, and the next day the British began to prepare their ships to bombard them. But a white flag was lifted over them, and a messenger arrived telling the British Admiral Guan was requesting a 3-day ceasefire so he could speak with Zishan. Charles Elliot was quite mortified by the massacre of Chanbi and accepted the 3-day ceasefire. Elliot's soldiers, however, were livid with his decision, and they wanted to simply march on Canton. To alleviate the men, Elliot ordered them to demolish the walls of Chanbi and the Taicaktao forts. Zishen then met with Elliot to negotiate at the Lotus Flower Wall due south of Canton City. Elliot brought with him a show of force, 56 Royal Marines, a 15-member Fife and Drum Band, and Captain Rosemel, commander of the French corvette named Danande. Inviting the French captain was a diplomatic courtesy and a method of keeping an eye on the French, whom the British, like I said, feared might take a shot at the spoils of war. Zishen performed the customary wining and dining of Elliot and his entourage, and eventually they began their diplomacy again. By January the 20th, they agreed to what has become known as the Chanbi Convention. The British agreed to purchase Hong Kong Island for $6 million, and that the Chinese would pay $6 million for the war reparations. Thus, it's kind of a swap, in other words. Both nations would exchange ambassadors, and now contact between the nations would be direct and official, no more tributary status. Above all else, trade would resume, and the British would hand over all the forts and places they had captured. Zishen presumed Emperor Daoguang and his Qing court would agree to these terms, and even made plans to extort the $6 million in reparations directly from the Hong merchants to sweeten the deal. Elliot had to assume Britain would be pleased, because messages took quite a long time to get back home. But, in fact, Palmerston and others in Parliament were quite livid Elliot did not get the 20,000 opium chest amount and the war reparation amount they had demanded. The British Foreign Minister said of the Chanbi settlement, "After all, our naval power is so strong that we can tell the Emperor what we mean to hold, rather than he should say what we should cede." Emperor Daoguang was so pissed off when he found out about the Hong Kong cession. He recalled Zishen immediately to Beijing and ordered the execution of Charles Elliot. Elliot would eventually receive word from Parliament about the Chanbi Convention, and that it turned out the British government refused to ratify the agreement. Uh-oh. On the same day the Chanbi Convention was signed, January the 20th of 1841, Emperor Daoguang ordered Qishan to stop negotiations with the barbarians because he was sending reinforcements to Canton from the interior. Thousands of Qing troops were en route under the command of a 70-year-old general named Yang Fang. Yang Fang was so old, it was alleged he was deaf and had to give his men orders only in writing. The emperor also sent with him his cousin, Yi Shan, as the new diplomat. Charles Elliot was completely aloof at the looming conflict, nor the emperor's rejection of the Chanbi Agreement. On January the 26th, Lieutenant Colonel George Burrell occupied Hong Kong Island in accordance with the Chanbi Agreement. Similar to the Chusan Island situation, Elliot allowed opium to be stored on Hong Kong Island. In a letter, at the time, from Matheson to Jardin, he mentioned, "Elliot says that he sees no objection to our storing of opium there, and as soon as the Chinese New Year holidays are over, I shall set about building." Soon Matheson began building an enormous stone fortress in Hong Kong and moved the company's headquarters there. Hong Kong became a brilliant new jewel in the crown of Her Majesty. It held a deep harbor and a very small population that would not give the British too much trouble. The British were overjoyed to leave the malaria dysentery-filled nightmare of Chusan for Hong Kong. By February the 1st, Charles Elliot proclaimed Hong Kong Island an official British territory and its residents subject under the Crown, something the Chanbi Convention never stipulated. Elliot met Qishan again, this time at a place called the Second Bar, a small island 20 miles southeast of Canton, to put the imperial seal upon the Convention of Chanbi. Qishan informed Elliot that he had been fired and that the emperor was really pissed off like hell, much to the shock of Elliot. Qing soldiers began to amass around the Bogue, and as noted by Commodore James Bremer in his military dispatch, "I must confess that from this moment my faith in the sincerity of the Chinese commissioner was completely destroyed. My doubts were also strengthened by the reports of the officers I sent up to the place of meeting, who stated that military works on a grand scale were in progress, troops collected on the heights, and camps protected by entrapments, arising on both sides of the river, and that the island of North Wangtung had become a mass of cannon." Elliot decided yet again to take up arms. On February the 26th, the Modesty, Druid, Wellesley, Queen, and Melville began to bombard the forts on Wangtung and Anongwai Island on the Bogue. There were 3 forts on Anongwai, holding 42, 60, and 40 cannons atop them each. The warship Blemheim, alongside Melville, Queen, and 4 rocket boats, approached the southernmost fort, dropping anchor just 600 yards away, and fired their broadsides. The Melville approached 5 minutes later, and within 400 yards of the fort, fired her broadsides in quick succession. A British officer who witnessed the scene said this: "The firing of these ships was most splendid. Nothing could withstand their deadly aim. 1 or 2 shot was sufficient for the dragon-hearted defenders of the North Fort, who, letting off their guns, fled up the hills." The 3 fort cannons were stationary guns, set at such a high elevation that when they returned fired, they were only able to hit the top sails of the British ships. The Chinese return fire lasted only 15 minutes. By 1:20 p.m., the fort stopped returning fire, and 300 Marines stormed the forts. By 1:30 p.m., the 3 forts were captured, and 250 were killed or wounded in Anongwai. Over in Wangtung Island, there was a 40-gun fort on its western side called the Yong'an Fort. Between this fort and the forts on Anongwai was a large boom chain cable to stop warships, and passage could not be made until all the forts were taken. Commodore Bremer, aboard his flagship, the Wellesley, alongside 7 other warships, began to bombard the fort and its batteries, and in less than an hour, the Chinese simply stopped firing back. By 1:30 p.m., Major Thomas Simpson Pratt commanded 1,037 troops to storm the beach of the island, and in the words of a British officer named Edward Belcher, Opposition there was none. The unfortunate Chinese literally crammed the trenches, begging for mercy. I wish I could add that it was granted. Belcher also alleges some Indian soldiers would begin executing prisoners when he personally tried to stop them. 2 were shot down whilst holding my shirt, and my gig's crew, perceiving my danger, dragged me away, exclaiming, "They will shoot you next, sir." There were around 2,000 Qing defenders on the island, and it is estimated 250 were killed and or wounded. The British claimed to have only 5 casualties. When the British and Indian force entered the forts, they found that the defenders had most likely fled the very moment the battle had begun. Within 2 hours, the forts on Anongwai and Wangtong were seized, with minimal effort. Charles Elliot stated he had almost died in the battle from a Chinese cannonball that had nearly hit him as he sat reclined in a hammock on the deck of his ship. You can't make that stuff up. Or perhaps you really can if you are the British during the 19th century trying to show off. Honestly, folks, when I give reports from this war, a lot of it comes from British primary sources, and I can assure you, they are embellishing the shit out of it. 1,000 Chinese were taken prisoner. Admiral Guan's body lay among the defenders. A bayonet was in his chest. The British gave the old warrior a cannon salute from the warship Blenheim, when his family retrieved the body and sailed off with it. With the fall of the Bogue forts, the mouth of the Canton River and the gateway to Canton belonged to the British. Lin Zexu wrote of the event, "I got home at the hour of the monkey," that's 3 p.m., "and when night came heard about the Bogue forts, and those on Wantong Island were being infested, preparatory to attack by the English rebels. I at once went to Deng and Tishen's office, and at the hour of the rat, that is 11 p.m., we heard that Wangtong, Yungan, and the Genggu forts had fallen. All night I could not sleep." On February the 27th, Elliot made his way up the Canton River aboard Nemesis when they came across the warship Cambridge, which was in some trouble. Cambridge had been captured and surrounded by Chinese war junks. When Nemesis alongside some other British steamers approached, the Chinese war junks opened fire on them. When the British ships managed to maneuver into a position where they could fire their broadsides, they sent a tremendous volley. Added to the shells were Congreve rockets, which set fires to many of the war junks. The Cambridge was also opening up fire upon the British as Chinese crews were operating her. The British bombardment after an hour soon sent the ships scattering about, and many of their crews jumped overboard. On the sides of the river were some earthen defense works with batteries, and the British troops began to land and storm their positions. Captain Thomas Herbert of the warship Calliope said of the event, "I landed with the seamen and marines and stormed the works, driving before us upwards of 2,000 of their best troops, and killing nearly 300. Lieutenant John Elliot Bingham of the Modesty wrote, "As the enemy fled before Lieutenant Stramham's party, they attempted to cross the deep branch of the river, in which numbers of them perished, and many were shot." Thus, the British claimed to have killed 300 Chinese during the battle near the First Bar Island on the Pearl River at the cost of losing a single man, with a couple wounded. The day after the battle, Lin Zexu wrote this, "I hear that yesterday the English rebels broke resistance at Wuyong. The regulars from Hunan were stationed there and had heavy losses, their commander, Sang Fu, being also among the killed." After the battle was over, the British realized they could not tow the Cambridge, so Elliot had the ship scuttled. During the firing upon the Chinese war junks, a British sailor died when his musket exploded in his hands. Elliot awaited some other ships and men before continuing to sail towards Canton. On March the 2nd, Commodore Bremer dispatched a force to prod Whampoa Island, which held a battery of around 25 cannons and around 250 Qing troops defending it. The smaller naval force of 3 British warships bombarded the island, destroying the cannons and defensive structures with ease. The Marines who stormed the island reported around 20 dead defenders, and that they lost a man to grape shot. Lin Zexu wrote in his diary on the day of the battle, I hear that the English rebel ships have already forced their way up to the fort at Leiti. Early in the morning, I went to talk things over at the general office in the monastery of the Great Giant Buddha. As the Armada made its approach to the city, 10,000 civilians fled, including Lin Zexu's family. An American merchant in Canton wrote this of the scene. Canton never looked so desolate. The hatred of those who had not fled registered in their faces. They scowl upon every one of us in a way indicative of a greater dislike than I have ever before observed. Canton's harbor was too shallow for the Nemesis to dock, so Elliot took her completely alone up the Canton River and back down, destroying apparently a few forts and 9 Chinese war junks. If that is to be believed, Nemesis truly lived up to its name. Wow. Poor Zishan was again recalled to Beijing to be punished. He was not only recalled, but arrested and cast into chains. He made it to Beijing by March the 12th, and his entire fortune of 425,000 acres of land, 135,000 ounces of gold, and 10 million in cash was taken from him by Emperor Daogang. Luckily for Zishan, his death sentence was reversed by the emperor to just hard labor at a military encampment near China's northernmost border with Russia. Lin Zexu did not receive blame for the military blunders and instead remained in power at Canton. The reason as to why this came to be might be because Lin Zexu was as guilty as every other Qing official in sending the emperor very embellished stories about the war. Here was one of his dispatches. Our regular troops sank 2 of their dinghies and shattered the main mast of one of their warships, after which they retired. Like all the other officials playing this game of broken telephone, Lin Zexu also feared the emperor's wrath, and for good reason. By March the 13th, the rest of the British Armada arrived outside Canton and began to blow all the Chinese ships to pieces within its harbor. The Armada also bombarded the city's walls, knocking out all of its cannons. On March the 19th, British Marines and sailors landed near the Foreign Factories district, forcing Qing defenders there to pull back and give no resistance. The next day, the British occupied their old English factory and planted the Union Jack back upon its roof. Our old friend Hao Qua came to Elliot at the English factory begging for a truce on behalf of General Fang. Elliot greeted Hao Qua kindly and agreed. He also told everyone in Canton that trade was to be restored. The mouths of the opium smugglers were watering at this, but Elliot then dictated that all opium found on any British ships was to be confiscated. Elliot was trying to make it known they were here for the tea trade, and to show Britain was going to be on its very best behavior. Unbeknownst to Elliot, the truce was a feint. For the next few days, the British watched Chinese ships full of Qing soldiers sail past the factory's vantage point. Despite Elliot's talk of confiscating all the opium, the smugglers were more bold than ever. With the British Armada acting basically as armed guards at this point, the smuggler ships came in, some carrying over 1,000 chests of opium each. Elliot was furious, and he tried to stop the opium vessels from unloading their cargo in Canton, but the merchants, they simply ignored him. Elliot feared getting chewed up by members of Parliament if he molested the dealers anymore, knowing full well Parliament had a ton of opium lobbyists working full-time. It's actually scarily like current governments today, if you think about it. Some, albeit I bet, a few politicians in Congress, Senate, or parliaments of large nations today actually want to put a stop to the world's most horrible troubles. For sure there are some of these politicians. Very few, mind you. But lobbyists are a very powerful force. And when your political job is at stake, well, like Mr. Elliot, how much do you put your neck on the line? Also, Elliot had greater issues to worry about. When the British took back the factory, the Qing officials set a price upon the heads of any British citizen, and a king's ransom of 50,000 for Elliot's head. Ever since the First Battle of the Bogue, Zishan and Lin Zexu had both been sending reports to Emperor Daoguang about how the war was going on. Lin Zexu was sending amazing tales of Qing victories, and they were all fabrications. Zishan was sending reports of how corrupt the Qing military had become, and how it had fallen to such lengths it could not even hope to match the barbarians. Zishan counseled strategic surrender and hinted towards resuming the opium trade. Well, we all know what happened to Qi for his most honest words on the military matters. General Yang Fang also urged the emperor to allow the opium trade to continue, arguing that if the British occupied themselves with making money, they would have little time or any desire to make war. The emperor replied to General Fang, however, "If trade were the solution to the problem, why would it be necessary to transfer and dispatch generals and troops?" Emperor Daoguang ordered General Fang and his colleagues Yishan and Longwen to take back Hong Kong immediately. By late March, Elliot had decided the next target was to be Amoy, around 400 miles northeast of Canton. Elliot thought it would be a good time to attack Amoy in May, but in the meantime he fell quite ill while in Macau. In the meantime, he was receiving intelligence reports from Canton that the city was being surrounded by more and more Qing soldiers. It seemed General Fang was amassing forces trying to bring the British back to the peace table. Elliot headed the show of military might by putting off the Amoy plans and concentrating on arming Canton. On May the 11th, Elliot took the Nemesis over to Canton, and he quickly saw the Chinese were building fortifications outfitted with new cannons. He also saw the Chinese Navy was increasing its presence in the area. To that end, he sent a letter to the governor asking they cease military preparations, but he received no word back. On May the 21st, Elliot ordered the British and even urged the Americans to leave the factory quarters. All of the British quickly left. Just a few Americans stayed, and in less than 24 hours, the factory quarters were shelled by Chinese military from the opposite side of the river. The Chinese then began sending fireboats from the river at the nearby British warships. Elliot had the Nemesis begin bombarding the Chinese war junks nearby, which used the fireships as their cover. The fireships failed to hit any of the British vessels and instead ran into shorelines, setting parts of Canton ablaze. Nemesis began firing on fortifications and the Chinese artillery positions, and by the morning, the battle over the sea all but dissipated. On May the 25th, Nemesis, escorting 70 other vessels full of thousands of troops, made its way to Tsingpu, 2 miles northwest of Canton proper. Tsingpu had a natural harbor from which the British formed a beachhead to assemble their forces and equipment. The military strategy involved multiple ships bombarding differing parts of Canton's defenses, and 2 invasion forces. The first force, which I will call the Right Force, was led by the warship Atalanta, consisting of 330 men of the 26th Cameronians, Madras artillery, and some other engineers. They were going to bombard the south walls of Canton, while they landed troops at the factory quarter to occupy it. The other force was that of Nemesis, which landed at Tsingpu, designated as the Left Force, consisting of 6,000 men with various troops such as the 49th Foot, 27th Madras Infantry, some Bengal volunteers, and 380 Royal Marines. Leading the Left Force was Major General Hugh Go, whom performed a reconnaissance of the area, and he said this: "The heights to the north of Canton were crowned by 4 strong forts and the city walls, which run over the southern extremity of these heights. They appeared to be about 3 miles and half a distant." Basically, if you had a map handy, of which there are many to be found on Google, the left force has landed northwest of Canton. To its east lies various hills and forts that protect the approach to the large wall defense of Canton City. There were 4 forts, each holding various cannons and troops. Go's force at 3 a.m. was being fired upon by the 2 most western forts of the 4. Then the British managed to place their artillery, some 12-pounder howitzers, 9-pounder artillery pieces, and half-a-pound mortars, and a ton of Congreve rockets. The British began to fire upon the 2 westernmost forts, while providing cover fire. Lieutenant Colonel Morris of the 49th advanced up the hill towards the nearest fort, while Major General Burrell led the 18th Royal Irish to support his flank. While this was occurring, the Qing sent a large military force to hit the right flank, but General Go saw this coming and he ordered some Royal Marines to close the flank up. With their land-based artillery and warships bombarding, the left force was able to capture all 4 forts, taking very light casualties, and when they occupied the forts, they held the vantage point overlooking Canton City. On May the 25th, Go's force began setting up around these 4 forts, when they saw an incoming force coming from the northeast of around 4,000 Qing soldiers. They were advancing through an open paddy field, and they attacked the British 49th at 3 p.m. The 49th were putting up a good fight, but then General Yang Fang showed up to the scene, rallying the troops and trying to overwhelm the 49th's position. Go quickly ordered the 18th Division with some Royal Marines to reinforce the 49th's position and placed Major General Burrell in charge of repelling the enemy. The fighting was intense, but the British force managed to rout the enemy and in turn burnt down their military encampments. By the early morning of May the 26th, Go had prepared his men for an invasion of Canton City's walls, but at 10 a.m. a white flag appeared overhead. Go sent the British interpreter, Thoms, to find out what the Qing wanted. The Qing envoy begged for hostilities to end, and Go agreed to a ceasefire, but he said through Thoms that they would only negotiate with the commander of the Qing forces in Canton. I had it explained that, as general commanding the British, I would treat with none but the general commanding the Chinese troops. That we came before Canton, much against the wishes of the British nation, but that repeated insults and breaches of faith had compelled us to make the present movement, and that I would cease from hostilities for 2 hours to enable their general to meet with me and Sir Le Flaming Senhouse. No Qing commander came forward, so Go resumed preparations to attack Canton's walls. Then at 7 a.m. the next morning, just as the British artillery was getting ready to fire, another white flag was raised, and some Qing soldiers were shouting the name Charles Elliot at them. It turns out the reason they were shouting this was because Elliot had been negotiating with the Qing during the course of the battle. Now since May the 26th, Major General Go was in a standstill position. His forces were occupying those 4 forts north of Canton City's walls, and his transport ships were over at the beachhead some 5 miles west of him. So there was Go, with 6,000 soldiers just loitering about in the blazing hot sun, basically in the middle of some paddy fields north of Canton. Now, you won't hear this from my main source, which, I will add, seems to be quite skewed towards the British side, but a major incident occurs here. A local villager named Wei Xiaoguang accused a British soldier of raping his wife. The local village populace became enraged, and soon a crowd of over 10,000 began swarming around the British position. They were armed with pikes, swords, and all the common village weapons you can think of. To make matters worse for some of the British, many of their muskets were sodden because of the marshy paddy field geography, and they were failing to fire when the villagers suddenly attacked. A 2-hour-long siege occurred, and the British had to withdraw into one of the western forts, which was soon surrounded. Go sent word to the governor of Canton, Yu Baochun, telling him if the villagers did not stop this siege, his force would commence an attack upon Canton City. Yu tried to stop the villagers, only to be labeled as a traitor to the people of Canton. It sounds like a lackluster event, but it actually is the beginning of a larger issue. You see, the villagers had taken matters into their own hands to deal with the foreign invaders because they saw their Qing government as just appeasing them and completely useless. This feeling that the Qing were weak or not doing enough would feed into multiple movements that would later break the Qing Dynasty. So think of it as just a single domino in a field of dominoes that were soon going to fall down. On May the 29th, General Fang suddenly broke the ceasefire, and he ordered his men to attack, shouting, "Exterminate the rebels!" Fire rafts were launched at the nearby British warships docked at Whampoa, but they failed to do any damage. Stinkpots were tossed at the British warships, and some warjunks tried using grappling hooks to board them. Some of Fang's forces broke into the factory quarter and began to pillage it. The British in response sent ships up the Pearl River to bombard the walls of Canton, but no soldiers were sent to invade the city. The secret reason as to why was because at this point the British troops were all being decimated by dysentery. In reality, the British had 2,500 able fighting men to face off a possible Qing force of 20,000 within Canton City. Luckily for the British, their warship bombardments were enough to draw out a truce agreement. Now, the Qing agreed to pay 6 million in the course of 7 days if the British promised not to sack the city of Canton. The Qing military would pull back at least 60 miles from Canton, and the British would pull back to the Bogue and occupy the forts there. There still remained major issues: the status of the opium trade and that of Hong Kong Island. Trade was still not resumed, and the compensation for the 20,000 opium chests had not been discussed. The British knew the situation was tense, and they ignored the issue for now to allow Canton to normalize again. The British also made sure to avoid mentions of a military victory over the Qing, as they wanted the emperor to save face, and thus be more likely to accept their deal. I would like to take this time to remind all of you this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. So please, go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast, the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube. Perhaps you want a bit more visuals? I have an episode on the First Opium War and the Second Opium War, and I did a historic film review of the 1997 film, The Opium War. A lot of Opium War stuff. Check it out, it means a lot to me. The British attacked Jambi, the Bogue, the First Bar Island, Whampoa Island, and now Canton, in their war to bring the Qing government to meet their demands. It seemed by taking Canton, a treaty might be formed at long last, and perhaps peace could be restored